I found out my best friend had been lying about me for years. I never said a word to him. I have spent a long time thinking about how to tell this story without making it sound like something it is not. It is not a story about hatred. It is not a story about a dramatic falling out or a screaming match or any of the things people imagine when they hear the words betrayal and best friend in the same sentence. It is quieter than that, and in some ways that quietness is what made it so difficult to sit with for so long. There was no single moment I could point to and say, that is when it happened. There was just a slow accumulation of information that eventually reached a weight I could no longer ignore, and then a decision I made about how to carry it. His name is Devin. We met at 14, first day of 9th grade, assigned to adjacent lockers in a hallway that smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet. He was the kind of person who talked easily, who moved through social situations without the friction that most 14-year-olds experience, and I was not that person. I was observant and reasonably confident but not naturally outgoing in the way Devin was, and I think in the beginning that contrast was part of why we worked. He was the one who initiated, who kept the energy moving, who pulled me into things I would not have found on my own. I was the one who listened, who remembered details, who was genuinely interested in the people around me in a way that Devin, I would come to understand much later, was not always capable of. We were inseparable through high school in the way that only happens at that age, when the boundaries between your life and your friend's life are permeable because you spend most of your waking hours in the same building. We had the same lunch period for 3 of 4 years. We played on the same rec basketball team for 2 summers. We drove to parties together when we got our licenses and sat in his car afterward for an hour talking about whatever had happened that night. My parents knew him, his parents knew me. His mom would ask about my grades. My dad would ask how Devin's college applications were going. We were woven into each other's lives in the way that feels permanent when you are inside it. I want to be honest about what kind of friend I was to Devin because it matters for what comes later. I was a loyal friend. That is not me patting myself on the back. Loyalty was something I considered seriously, even at that age. If Devin needed something, I was there. If he was in a bad situation, I helped without making a production of it. When he went through a rough patch junior year involving a girl he had been seeing and some things she said about him that were not entirely fair, I defended him to people who were inclined to believe her. I did not do that performatively. I did it because he was my friend and I believed in him. We went to different colleges, which changed the shape of the friendship but did not end it. We lived about 3 hours apart, saw each other on breaks and a few weekends a year, texted regularly. The adjustment was normal. Adult friendship is naturally less dense than the version you have at 14 when you share a hallway. I understood that, and so did he, and we maintained what we had with what felt like genuine mutual effort. After college, we both ended up in the same city, which was not planned but felt like a good sign. We fell back into a regular rhythm pretty naturally. There was a friend group that formed organically around shared social circles, people we had met through work or through other friends, and Devin and I were both anchors in that group in different ways. He was the social engine, the one who organized things and kept the calendar moving. I was more of a consistent presence, the person who showed up reliably and who people seemed to come to when something was actually wrong rather than just when there was a party. The group solidified around a core of maybe 8 people. There was a guy named Chris who I had known through a mutual connection, and his girlfriend at the time, Natalie. There was a woman named Simone who had gone to college with Devin and who I got along with well from the beginning. There was a couple named Will and Adrian who came in through a work connection of Devin's. And there were a few others who floated in and out depending on the season and who was dating whom. For a few years, this was my social world, the people I spent weekends with, celebrated birthdays with, took occasional trips with. I liked most of them genuinely and felt genuinely liked in return, or thought I did. The first thing that did not sit right happened about 3 years into this period. I was at a small dinner, just 4 of us, me and Devin and Chris and Natalie, at a restaurant near the apartment Chris and Natalie shared. Conversation moved the way it does at a relaxed dinner between people who know each other well, easy and jumping around, and at some point we got onto the topic of a job situation I had been navigating. I had been passed over for a promotion about a month earlier, something I had processed pretty quickly and moved on from, but it came up because Chris asked about it. I told them what had happened, Standard story, the role went to someone external. My manager gave me a feedback conversation that was vague in the specific way corporate feedback conversations tend to be. I had decided to stay and see what the next cycle looked like. I was not bitter about it when I told the story. It was just a thing that had happened. Natalie said, "Yeah, Devin mentioned that had been a tough stretch for you." I looked at her. I looked at Devin. He was picking up his drink with the particular casual focus of someone who would prefer not to be looked at. I told Natalie it had not been a particularly tough stretch, just one thing that did not go my way. She said, "Oh," and nodded, and the conversation shifted. But I held onto the phrasing. Tough stretch. It was not how I would have described it. It was not accurate. I thought about it on the drive home. It was possible Natalie had applied her own editorial to something Devin had said, that he had mentioned the promotion and she had characterized it as a tough stretch on her own. That was possible. I did not confront it because it was a small thing and I was not certain enough of what it meant to make it into anything. The second thing happened about 4 months later. I had started seeing someone, a woman named Dana who I had met through work, and I was genuinely happy about it. It was the kind of early relationship that has a lightness to it, nothing heavy yet, just two people finding that they like each other more every time they spend time together. I mentioned it to Devin probably 3 weeks in because that is what you do with your best friend. He asked a few questions, seemed interested, and I did not think about the conversation beyond that. About 6 weeks later, I was at a gathering at Will and Adrienne's place, a birthday thing for Adrienne, and Simone pulled me aside at some point in the evening. She said she wanted to ask me something because she did not want to make assumptions. She said she had heard I was going through something personally and she just wanted to check in. I told her I was not going through anything that I was aware of. She looked slightly uncertain. She said, "I might have the wrong information, never mind." I told her it was fine and asked what she had heard. She said Devin had mentioned that I had started seeing someone but that it seemed complicated and that I might be going through it a bit. I told her specifically that things with Dana were actually going really well, that it was not complicated, and that I was not going through anything. She looked at me for a second and then said, "Okay, I clearly have the wrong information." She said it nicely and I believed her genuinely. She was not the problem. I drove home that night with something settled in my chest that I did not fully want to name yet. 2 incidents is not a pattern in any scientific sense, but it is enough to make a person pay attention. Both times, Devin had offered information about me to other people in the group. Both times, the information had been slightly off in the same direction. Not wildly wrong, not fabricated entirely, just tilted. The promotion not going my way became a tough stretch. A relationship that was going well became something complicated I was going through. The tilt in both cases pointed the same way, which was toward a version of me that was struggling a bit more than I actually was. I sat with this for a while without doing anything about it. I am not someone who reacts quickly to things I am uncertain about. The habit I have had since I was young is to gather, to wait, to make sure I understand what I am actually looking at before I decide what to do about it. So I gathered. Over the following several months, I paid closer attention to things I had probably been processing unconsciously for a long time. I noticed that when the group made plans, I was occasionally the last to be contacted, sometimes not contacted by the organizer at all and only finding out through Devin. I had always assumed that was just loose planning. I began to wonder whether it was something else. I noticed that certain people in the group, Will in particular, had an energy around me that was slightly different from how he was with other people, careful in a way that did not quite match the relationship I thought we had. I noticed that when I told a story in a group setting that went well, landed the way I intended, Devin had a specific response that I now recognize as a recalibration, a slight adjustment in his energy, hard to describe but consistent. None of these things individually meant anything conclusive. Together, with the context of the 2 specific incidents, they started to form something. The moment that made everything clear happened on a Tuesday in March. I know it was a Tuesday because I was working from home and had no meetings after 2 in the afternoon, which is why I was the one who answered when Chris called. Chris and I had developed a genuine independent friendship by this point, separate from the larger group, and he called occasionally just to talk or to make plans. This was one of those calls, casual and meandering, the kind where you cover a lot of ground without any particular agenda. We talked for maybe 40 minutes. Near the end of the conversation, Chris said something that landed differently than he intended it to. He said, I want to say I feel like I have gotten to know you pretty well these past couple of years, and you are not what I expected when I first met you. I asked him what he had expected. He paused for a moment in the way people do when they realize the answer requires some navigation. Then he said, honestly, based on what Devin had said about you when he introduced you to the group, I thought you were going to be a lot more difficult to be around. I asked him what Devin had said. Another pause. He said just that you could be negative sometimes, a little hard to deal with, that you had some things you were working through. He said it in the tone of someone reporting history that has been thoroughly contradicted by subsequent experience. Not malicious, just honest. He said, but that has just never been my experience of you at all, so I don't know. I thanked him for saying it, and we wrapped up the call a few minutes later. I sat at my desk afterward for a long time without doing anything. That was the moment the full shape of it became clear, and the clarity was not dramatic, it was just solid and heavy and impossible to look away from. Devin had been managing my reputation in the group from the beginning. Not with lies that were easy to identify and disprove. With the specific, low-grade kind of image shaping that is almost impossible to confront directly because each individual instance is deniable. He told people I could be negative and difficult to be around before they had the chance to form their own impressions of me. When something happened in my life, he reported it to the group in a version that was slightly worse than reality. When I was going through nothing, I was apparently going through something. When I was doing well, there was apparently a but attached that he had added on my behalf. The question I had to sit with was why. I thought about this for a long time, and I want to be careful about how I characterize my conclusion because I am not inside Devin's head and I cannot claim certainty. What I believe, based on knowing him for the better part of 2 decades at that point, is that Devin needed to be the most capable person in his close relationships. Not the most accomplished in any objective sense, not the best looking or the most successful, but the person who was most together, most in control, most reliably fine. And I think that my general stability, my tendency to handle things without making a lot of noise about it, sat uncomfortably with that need. The simplest way to resolve that discomfort, without doing anything that looked overtly hostile, was to quietly adjust the picture. To add a little shadow to my image in the spaces where he controlled the information. It is a subtle thing to do, and I think it was mostly unconscious. I do not believe Devin sat down and planned a campaign. I think it was closer to a habit, a reflex, the way some people reflexively minimize others when they feel the comparison is unflattering. He had been doing it probably for years, possibly since high school in ways I never noticed because I was inside it, and the structure of the friend group we had built in adulthood gave him a platform to do it with more effect. The decision I made after sitting with all of this is the part of the story that people find hardest to understand, so I want to explain it carefully. I decided not to say anything to him. Not because I was afraid of the conversation, and not because I did not have enough to say. I had plenty to say. I could have called him and laid out exactly what I knew, walked him through the specific incidents, told him what Chris had told me, and asked him to explain it. I could have done that. I chose not to. The reason I chose not to is that a confrontation would have required me to invest in the relationship in a way I had already stopped believing was worth it. To confront someone, really confront them, is an act of engagement. Says, this matters enough to me to fight for. What I understood, sitting at my desk after the call with Chris, was that it did not matter enough to fight for. Not because I was indifferent to the betrayal, I was not indifferent to it, it genuinely hurt. But because what the confrontation would have given me was a conflict with someone I no longer trusted, and what I wanted was simply to be free of the situation. There is also a more practical element, which is that confronting him would have handed him the opportunity to manage the narrative again. He was better at the social performance of these things than I was. In a confrontation, he would have been contrite and confused and hurt, and I would have come out of it looking like someone who had made a serious accusation based on a few secondhand comments. The group would have heard about it because things always get heard about, and the result would have been exactly the portrait he had been painting of me. Difficult, negative, hard to deal with. So I said nothing to him directly. What I did instead was much simpler. I just stopped. I stopped being the version of myself that had made the friendship what it was. I stopped initiating. I stopped showing up early to things he organized and staying late. I stopped being the person who checked in when something seemed off with him, which had always been part of the texture of our friendship and which I now recognized he had never reciprocated in any genuine way. I stopped sharing things about my life that he could report to other people with his particular editorial touch. I became friendly and surface level, the way you are with someone you see at group events but do not actually know. I also did something that I think mattered more than anything else. I started investing directly in the individual relationships within the group that had been mostly mediated through Devin. I called Chris more. I made plans with Simone independently. I had conversations with Will and Adrian that were not happening in the context of a larger gathering. I was not strategic about this in a scheming way. I was just doing what I should have been doing from the beginning, getting to know these people on my own terms rather than through the filter of someone who had a vested interest in how I was seen. The effect of this was gradual, and I did not watch it with any kind of triumphant attention. I just lived my life. But over the following year or so, the relationships in the group shifted in a way that I think reflected reality more accurately than they had before. People who had initially had whatever impression Devin had seeded began to know me through actual sustained interaction, and the impression changed accordingly. Will, who had always been a little careful around me, became genuinely easy and warm. Simone became one of the people I talked to most regularly, and at some point told me that I was one of the most straightforward people she knew, which she said in a way that implied it surprised her, which told me something about what she had been given to work with initially. Devin noticed the change in my investment in the friendship, of course. He brought it up about 6 months in the careful way people bring up things they are not sure they want to have confirmed. We were alone for the first time in a while, having grabbed coffee after a group thing wound down, and he asked if something was wrong between us. I told him nothing was wrong. I told him I had just been busy and that things had been a bit quieter on my end socially. He looked at me for a moment and then said okay, and we talked about other things. He brought it up one more time, maybe 4 months after that, and I gave essentially the same answer, and that was the last time he asked. There is a specific conversation I had with Chris about a year after that Tuesday in March that I think about sometimes. We were at a bar watching a game, just the two of us, and somewhere in the evening Chris said, unprompted, that he had been thinking about something. He said that he had noticed over the past year or so that Devin often seemed to have a version of events about people in the group that did not quite match what those people were actually like when you got to know them. He said he had started noticing it with someone else in the group, a newer person who Devin had framed in a particular way and who Chris had then gotten to know independently and found to be nothing like the framing. He said he did not know what to make of it exactly. I listened to him and I did not say, I know, I have known this for a year, here is everything I figured out. I told him that people sometimes project things onto others without realizing it, and that first impressions are unreliable, and that the best thing you can do is form your own opinions. He seemed to find this useful even though it did not answer what he was actually asking. I think part of him already understood what he was circling and was not sure he wanted it confirmed. I respected that. Devin and I are still in the same social orbit. We see each other at group things several times a year, and we are friendly in the way that people are friendly when they share a long history but no longer share much present tense. We do not hang out one-on-one. We text occasionally, usually triggered by something external, a sports result, someone else's news, a throwback from the old days that one of us sends because it genuinely made us laugh. The texture of it is perfectly civil. If you watched us interact at a party, you would not notice anything wrong. You would just see two people who have known each other a long time being easy and warm in the way that comfort produces. Nobody in the group knows the specifics of what I know. I never told the story to Chris, not fully. I never told it to Simone or Will or anyone else. There was no dramatic revelation, no conversation where the mask came off, no moment of public accounting. That is not how it went, and I did not need it to go that way. What I needed, and eventually got, was to be known by the people around me as myself rather than as the slightly diminished version someone else had been circulating. That happened slowly and without ceremony, and it was enough. The people I actually wanted in my life got to form their own impressions, and the impressions they formed were accurate, and the relationships that grew from those impressions are real in a way the earlier ones were not entirely. Dana and I are still together, which is its own thing and maybe the part of this story I am most grateful for. She never met Devin the close friend, only Devin the person at group events, and she has told me more than once that she finds him slightly exhausting in the particular way she finds people exhausting when their social performance requires too much energy to maintain. I did not give her any context for that impression. She arrived at it on her own. There is something I want to say about what I learned from this, not in a way that ties everything up too neatly because I do not think it ties up neatly. What I learned is that the instinct to confront, to demand an explanation, to make someone answer for what they did, comes from a desire to be understood by the person who wronged you. And sometimes that desire is worth pursuing. But sometimes the person who wronged you is not capable of understanding it in a way that would give you what you actually need. Devin could have sat across from me and heard everything I had to say and responded in a way that was articulate and seemingly remorseful, and it would have meant nothing, because the behavior was not the result of a misunderstanding that could be corrected through conversation. It was the result of something in how he was built, something that had been operating for years, and a conversation was not going to reach it. What reached it, in the end, was just time and distance and the slow replacement of his version of me with the actual one. That happened not because I engineered it, but because the truth, when given enough contact with people, tends to surface. You do not have to fight for it. You just have to stop helping the alternative stay in circulation. I have not told Devin any of this, and I do not plan to. He knows something shifted. I believe on some level he knows why, the way people know things about themselves that they have not chosen to examine directly. But we will not be having that conversation, because I am not interested in what that conversation would produce. What I am interested in is the life I have been building in the time I used to spend being someone's supporting character in a story that did not reflect me. That life is going well. The work is good, the relationship is real, the people around me are people I chose and who chose me with accurate information. It is a quiet kind of outcome. There is no scene, no applause, no final confrontation where the truth comes out in front of everyone. There is just the ordinary texture of a life that is honest, which is more than I had before, and which is, I have found, more than enough.